If you're going to solve the problem of suffering, it's not about questioning everything in the world right now. Christianity itself is doing that, isn't it? What does God want to create in us, and how does He want to create it? That's the issue. It's become about believing in Jesus and going to heaven. We've come to believe in Jesus, but we have to live our reality without understanding God's intention. And because reality is tough, all we can think about is just surviving, getting by day to day. There's nothing beyond that anymore. Shouldn't we have peace? Shouldn't everything go well? These are our common religious expectations. We earnestly pray like this: God, please bless me so you don't have to come back again. We phrase it that way, but that's ultimately what we're saying. But suffering is essential in God's work. Let's try to unravel this paradox and contradiction, why suffering must be necessary, by walking through the story from the Exodus to Canaan. We all know the Exodus story very well, right? Those who believe in Jesus know that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, and they were led to the promised land flowing with milk and honey. But this Exodus event wasn't simply about being freed from slavery in Egypt and going to some happy land of many tribes. There's important content we need to look at more closely. When God sent Moses to rescue his people from slavery in a foreign land, the people naturally received this as something they had long hoped and wished for. They had to serve as slaves, so they needed freedom. But Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. So God sent 10 plagues. And after the final plague, Pharaoh surrendered and released them, but then changed his mind and pursued them. At the Red Sea, with the impassable waters ahead and the Egyptian army chasing behind, the people found themselves in a desperate situation. Why did you bring us out when we were living well, promising liberation only to trap us in a dead end? They complained. Moses made his famous confession of faith: stand still and see the salvation the Lord will accomplish for you. God parted the Red Sea, and they crossed over to freedom. But as you know, in the wilderness ahead, the Israelites repeatedly complained and failed when faced with hardships. No food, no water. The journey is hard. Various things made them complain and grumble. Each time, God struck water from the rock, gave manna from heaven, made quail cover the camp, and led them with a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud by day. When they reached a place near Canaan to enter it, they sent 12 spies, and the report appears in Numbers 13. But 10 of the 12 spies said they couldn't enter. They were afraid. The people there were too strong, and they didn't have the ability to take the land. So their excuse turned into complaints again. You brought us out when we were living well in Egypt, made us suffer like this, and are leading us to death. As you know, Joshua and Caleb had faith and tried to persuade them. But when the majority of the people complained and even tried to kill Moses, God appeared. And he said, "You who have no faith will die in this wilderness." So they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. That generation died out, and only their descendants finally entered Canaan. This is a well-known story, but there's one point we need to address. When God rescued his people from Pharaoh's hand, he didn't make the people do anything. He alone intervened with the 10 plagues and subdued Pharaoh. In the wilderness, too, God provided for all the people's complaints. But when it came to entering Canaan, when they complained and grumbled, he declared a harsh judgment. Fine. According to your decision, you cannot enter. Why was God so lenient with their complaints before, answering their grumbling, but so strict about entering Canaan? That's the question. The Exodus, or rather if you think about it carefully, isn't just about leaving Egypt, it's about entering Canaan. To enter Canaan, they first had to leave Egypt. When we leave this room, we leave because we have somewhere to go, and to get where we're going, we have to leave here. So while God brought them out of Egypt, they had to enter Canaan by their own strength. That's the important point of the Exodus event. Therefore, entering means that while God grants us salvation from sin, liberation from the chains of sin, the problem of making those liberated people into the people God intends is something you yourselves must answer and accomplish. That's the Exodus event. The two words that represent and characterize Christian faith are love and faith. Because love and faith are valuable words even in our world, we tend not to question further that love and faith represent the characteristics of Christian faith. They're right words, good words, and we accept them as expected concepts. But the love and faith that the Bible speaks of refer to relationships between equal persons. In that love and faith, neither party can be superior or subordinate. To have love and faith, both parties must have equal status. Only then can they share love and faith. Equal status here means equality in personal relationships, in relational dynamics. So faith and love require that both parties have voluntary choice. We often use faith or love or religious submission as if we should give up ourselves before God and say, God, please take care of everything from now on. But the Bible doesn't say that, and even submission requires voluntariness. To have voluntariness and make voluntary choices, freedom must exist. That's a clear and necessary condition, and He gave us that freedom. Then whether the one with that freedom will make the right choice or the wrong choice is always at stake here. Here's the problem. When we're told to choose, whether we'll make the right choice or the wrong choice becomes a matter of ability, right? But in this freedom given to make choices, freedom has two major aspects. One is rights, and one is responsibility. In other words, whether to use freedom as a right or as a responsibility is the privilege that freedom possesses. That's what we as beings with freedom must choose. What shows us whether we make this choice correctly or incorrectly is the wilderness life. The characteristic of wilderness life, as I mentioned earlier, is that God provides food and clothing. So in Deuteronomy chapter 8, it says, "Remember these 40 years of wilderness life. God never let you lack food or clothing. However, you failed. That was your trial. That was testing you." What was He testing? Even with freedom, the Israelites' response in the wilderness was to complain whenever things got difficult. Their response was to go back. Let's go back to Egypt. When they were thirsty without water, let's go back to Egypt. When they had no food, they complained and said, let's go back. It's expressed that way. In Egypt, they never lacked food or clothing and had nothing to worry about. But after coming out to the wilderness, there was no food, no clothing, and it was unbearably difficult. Let's go back. That's where the Bible's message lies. What does going back mean? It's a response that has absolutely no concept or understanding of freedom. Egypt's value was a place where, even as slaves, they had no worries about eating and drinking. The complaints in the wilderness arose because of what they had gained, freedom. What kind of situation was it? It was God's challenge. What challenge? With food and clothing provided, who are you? What is my identity? What will you become? Being able to ask these questions only became possible after leaving the wilderness. In Egypt, there was no time for such thoughts, because they weren't free people. They had no freedom. There's a famous and interesting movie about the problem of freedom. I strongly recommend it to those taking my lectures. The Shawshank Redemption. If Shawshank is a prison, the protagonist is imprisoned there. But Shawshank with redemption, it's the Shawshank Redemption. Redemption of Shawshank Prison. But Shawshank is the name of an Egyptian dynasty. Shawshank was a king several years after Pharaoh's time. In our Korean Bible, it appears as Shishak, and when Jeroboam was driven out by Solomon and went into political exile, he fled to Egypt. So the Shawshank Redemption has an Old Testament background. It's a story of Egypt gaining redemption. The protagonist, Andy, gets a life sentence and goes in, and there's a prisoner named Red who was already there. When Andy enters, he reveals attitudes and ways of being that the other prisoners cannot understand. He seems special to the prisoners who can't stand as free people. And later he spectacularly escapes, and that climax seems to be the protagonist's escape. But the movie doesn't end there and continues a bit longer. Everyone's wish is to get out, but they have no way to leave. They share resignation and despair in this prison. In that process, one old lifer gets parole first, but they receive news that he committed suicide outside. Then Red says, when you first see that wall, it looks like an obstacle. But as time passes, you come to depend on it. He makes a sad statement. And sometime later, Red also gets parole and gets a job at the supermarket where the person who left before had worked. He bags items at the supermarket. And there's a brief scene in the movie where he raises his hand like this and looks at the manager, and the manager comes over. What is it? I'd like to go to the bathroom. Then the manager says this. You don't need permission to go to the bathroom. And the protagonist sits on a park bench, troubled, holding his head, saying, I can't do anything. I've lived my whole life getting permission, and I can't even urinate without permission. This is my prison. Then there's a scene of him going back and forth in front of a gun shop. I want to go back. Should I take out that gun and go back? The climax the movie wanted to reach is this. This is more frightening. Freedom is frightening. Freedom is unbearable, isn't it? You have to take responsibility. You have to take responsibility for your existence and your identity. Inside prison, identity and responsibility aren't necessary. If you don't cause trouble, there are no worries. There's no worry about raising children or being robbed. That's what the movie stabs at us with. The Shawshank Redemption, the story of Egypt being redeemed. We only think about Israel being redeemed from Egypt, but Egypt later becomes part of salvation in the prophet's prophecies too. By Israel's exodus, that world bound by death, the door to redemption opens, even including Egypt's redemption. So think about it. What is suffering? God is giving us responsibility. What responsibility? Challenging us about the identity we must be responsible for and the values we must take responsibility for. That is the present time. In other words, if you believe in Jesus, you no longer have to worry. Cast all your cares and worries upon Jesus. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. These things are misunderstood in the wrong direction, and the explanation for Christians becomes that we cannot bear the serious identity, the heavy destiny that the world cannot give, and all the challenges that our reality and our lives face. We fail to become capable people in the process of being made, and we can't reach maturity. So why is there suffering? You know what it means to say school is suffering, right? In Tom Sawyer's Adventures, Tom goes to school, but his close friend Huckleberry Finn is a beggar. He doesn't go to school and sleeps when he wants to sleep and wanders when he wants to wander. To Tom, Huckleberry seems freer and he feels bound. What Tom desires most is to be like Huckleberry, not going to school, seeming free. But think about it. Going to school is an essential process for becoming excellent as a human being. Becoming excellent, in school they don't say it clearly yet, isn't just about studying well. Having classmates, having friends in the same class, is hugely important. As you keep going to school, does it get easier? It gets more and more complicated. Don't your children ask you, do I have to go to school? They desperately ask. And finishing elementary school isn't the end. You go to middle school. Finishing middle school isn't the end. You go to high school. You're led to increasingly difficult paths. Studying well is hard, and studying well doesn't directly bring me happiness right now, nor does it solve complicated problems. As you know, nowadays adolescence hits around middle school second year, right? When you go to school, they don't care about your adolescence at all, just study. Which university can you get into with this? You have nowhere to go. Going through adolescence in this pressure, when you go home, do your parents understand? When you go to school, does the teacher understand? Right? You have to share these deep problems with immature kids, your peers. You think about suicide, you complain, you resent the day you were born. These things, when they come into Christian faith, are like being rescued from Egypt, but having to wander in the wilderness. Why do I have to suffer like this? If not, what are you trying to do? Trying to enter Canaan. They sent spies and saw that there's no hope of entering. There's no ability. In that wandering without ability, whether worldly people wander or believers wander, the same reaction occurs. Identity, the reason for living this reality, how to live, without these things being clear, constantly being in challenge and trial, that becomes our greatest complaint and cry. Here lies the reason for suffering. What does God want to make of us? God wants to share love with us, share faith with us. God who created heaven and earth, God who is the source of all blessings, wants to have an equal relationship with us. We need to understand more deeply the biblical word that suffering is the gateway to glory. Suffering ultimately means God is asking us about our identity and asking for our choices. So we go through a process of learning who we are, how we should live, and what our destiny is. But unable to bear that confusion, that tension, that weight. We think, if you believe in God, shouldn't you have peace? Shouldn't everything go well? With our common religious mindset, we earnestly pray like this: God, please bless me so I don't have to come back to you again. How can I pray so I don't have to come back to God again? We phrase it that way, but that's ultimately what we mean. And another thing is, by repenting and acknowledging all past wrongs, please keep me from sinning again and give me peace of mind. This is natural for all believers. The biblical process to achieve what faith should accomplish. This process of suffering, of challenge, of asking our identity and how God's promises become ours. This process of enlightenment gets ignored. It only gets expressed as evasion, as complaints and cries, I think.